The Grand Deliberation Chamber was built to make those who entered it feel small. Its ceiling rose so high that it vanished into shadow, and its walls were lined with carved stone tablets bearing the names of every treaty the Galactic Concord had ever brokered. Tiered seating rose in wide arcs on every side, so that hundreds of alien delegates could sit above the main floor and look down upon whoever stood at the center. It was a room designed to remind everyone of the Concord's power and history, and it did its job well. The human delegation was given a table at the very bottom of the chamber, positioned directly in the center of the floor. Every other delegation sat above them, arranged by rank and seniority. The Vithari Dominion held a large section on the upper left, their dark insectoid forms motionless and watchful. The Arillan delegation occupied the highest tier, their silver faces calm and unreadable. And presiding over everything from a raised platform at the far end of the chamber was Grand Arbiter Silene, an Arillan elder whose thin frame and soft voice hid a mind that had controlled galactic diplomacy for over a century. Daniel sat at his table, with Laura on his left and Kevin on his right. Behind them, the rest of their team filled a single row of seats. He looked up at the hundreds of faces staring down and felt the weight of every eye in the room. He straightened his back, folded his hands on the table, and waited. The first day was spent entirely on procedural matters. Arbiter Silene opened the session by reading the formal charges and grievances from both sides. The Vithari claimed that human expansion into the border region had been aggressive and provocative. Humanity maintained that the colony of New Elysium had been established in unclaimed space, and that the Vithari bombardment had been an act of unprovoked war. Silene listened to both statements with the same expression of quiet patience, then announced that the chamber would spend the next 2 days reviewing evidence and establishing the framework for negotiation. Those 2 days were exhausting. Laura presented humanity's case with precision, laying out military logs, sensor data, and colony records that proved New Elysium had been settled legally and peacefully. She showed the chamber the timeline of events, how the Vithari fleet had arrived without warning and opened fire on a civilian population that had no military defenses. She presented casualty figures, damage assessments, and emergency transmissions recorded during the bombardment. The evidence was clear, detailed, and damning. It was also dismissed almost immediately. The Concord's review board classified the human evidence as unverified, pending independent confirmation, which Kevin quietly explained to Daniel meant that it would sit in a file somewhere and never be looked at again. When Laura objected, Arbiter Silene told her calmly that the Concord had established procedures for evidence review and that humanity would need to be patient. The Vithari evidence, by contrast, was accepted without question. Zoltek presented a series of documents claiming that human ships had made threatening maneuvers near Vithari territory months before the bombardment. The documents were vague and lacked supporting data, but the review board stamped them as verified within minutes. Daniel watched this happen and said nothing, but Laura could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. Kevin was busy during the breaks between sessions. He moved through the corridors of Alphara Prime with quiet purpose, speaking to contacts he had built over years of cultural work. Most of the senior delegations would not talk to him, but the smaller ones were more willing. The Telvanni, an amphibious species with wide dark eyes and gentle voices, were particularly open. Their junior ambassador, a soft-spoken figure named Relvan, told Kevin over a shared meal that the Concord had treated the Telvanni in much the same way decades ago. They had been pressured into signing a treaty that reduced their fleet and opened their home waters to Concord patrols. Relvan said they had signed because they were afraid, and they had regretted it ever since. The avian Korath were more cautious, but equally sympathetic. Their lead diplomat, a tall feathered figure with sharp golden eyes, caught Kevin in a corridor and told him in a low voice that humanity should read the treaty very carefully. The nomadic Scythene, who traveled in vast caravan fleets and had no permanent homeworld, sent a brief, encrypted message to the human delegation that contained only 3 words: "They are lying." Daniel gathered his team in their quarters each evening to review the day's events. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The Concord was not conducting a fair negotiation. Every procedural decision went against humanity. Every piece of human evidence was delayed or dismissed. Every Vethari claim was accepted at face value. The smaller delegations watched in silence, and the larger ones either participated in the bias or simply looked the other way. On the 3rd day, Zoltek made his move. He stood before the chamber and declared, in a voice that echoed off the stone walls, that the Vethari Dominion required a formal apology from humanity for the military response at New Elysium. He called the human counterattack a reckless and disproportionate act of violence against a sovereign power. He said that any peace agreement must begin with humanity acknowledging its fault and accepting responsibility for escalating the conflict. The chamber murmured in agreement. Several senior delegations nodded. Arbiter Silene watched from her platform with her hands folded, her expression suggesting that she found this a perfectly reasonable request. Daniel stood slowly. The chamber went quiet. He thanked Zoltek for his statement and said that he understood the importance of accountability. Then he opened a small device on his table and projected into the center of the chamber a holographic recording taken from the surface of New Elysium during the bombardment. The recording showed buildings collapsing under orbital fire. It showed people running through streets filled with smoke and dust. It showed a hospital folding in on itself like paper. It showed the faces of the dead. He let it play for 30 seconds. The chamber was completely silent. Then he turned it off and said calmly and clearly that 12,417 human beings had died that night. He said that they had been farmers, teachers, engineers, children, and old people who had done nothing wrong except build a life on a world that someone else decided they wanted. He said that humanity had responded to the bombardment with force, because that was what any civilization with a conscience would do when its people were being killed. And he said that he would not apologize for defending the lives of innocent people, not today, not tomorrow, and not ever. The silence that followed was so deep that you could hear the hum of the station's environmental systems. Zoltek's 4 eyes blinked rapidly, his mandibles clicking with a sound like stones grinding together. Arbiter Silene stared at Daniel for a long moment, then called a recess without explanation. During the break, Relvan approached Kevin in one of the station's quiet gardens. The Telvanni's wide dark eyes were troubled. He told Kevin that the human evidence would never be fairly reviewed. He said that the outcome of the negotiations had been decided before humanity ever arrived at the station. The entire process, he said, was a performance meant to give the appearance of fairness while delivering a result that had already been agreed upon by the Concord's inner circle. Kevin brought this information back to Daniel that evening. Laura was already pacing the room, her face tight with frustration. She said that every legal avenue she had tried had been blocked or redirected. The Concord was not interested in justice. It was interested in control. Daniel sat in his chair and listened to both of them. Then he said that they needed to prepare for the possibility that what was being offered to them here was not diplomacy at all. It looked like diplomacy. It sounded like diplomacy. But underneath the polite words and the grand chamber and the ancient traditions, it was something much simpler. It was a demand to submit, wrapped in enough ceremony to make submission look like choice. Laura asked him what he wanted to do. Daniel said he did not know yet, but he said they should be ready for anything, because the next few days were going to decide not just the future of this negotiation, but the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. Outside the window of their quarters, the dead star of the Kareth expanse hung in the darkness, cold and patient, waiting to see what the living would do. On the 5th day of negotiations, the Concord unveiled its final draft of the peace treaty. It arrived on the human delegation's data terminal at exactly 6 in the morning, delivered without warning or ceremony. Laura was already awake when it came through. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat down at her desk, and began reading. She did not stop for 14 hours. The document was 206 pages long, written in the dense, formal language that the Concord used for all its legal instruments. Every sentence was carefully constructed, every clause layered with subclauses and exceptions and references to previous treaties that made the whole thing almost impossible to understand on a first reading. Laura read it 3 times. Each time the picture became clearer, and each time it became worse. She called Daniel and Kevin into the briefing room at midnight. The rest of the legal team was already there, their faces drawn with exhaustion and something close to disbelief. Laura stood at the head of the table and laid it out piece by piece, because she wanted Daniel to understand not just what the treaty said, but what it meant. The first section dealt with territory. The treaty required the Sol Confederation to surrender 3 colony worlds to the Vethari Dominion as a condition of peace. Those worlds were New Elysium, Briar's Landing, and Port Callaway. New Elysium was the world the Vethari had bombed. Briar's Landing was a mining colony that supplied nearly a third of humanity's refined metals. Port Callaway was a young agricultural settlement with a population of almost 200,000 people. The treaty did not offer compensation for any of these losses. It simply stated that the worlds would be transferred and that all human citizens would have 90 days to leave. The second section dealt with military restrictions. The treaty required humanity to reduce its naval fleet by 60% within 1 standard year. It specified which classes of ships were to be decommissioned and set hard limits on the number of warships humanity could build in the future. Any military exercises within 5 light years of Vethari space would require prior approval from the Concord. Laura noted that the Vethari faced no equivalent restrictions of any kind. The third section was the one that made Laura's voice go quiet when she read it aloud. It called for permanent Concord military observers to be stationed on Earth and Mars. These observers would have the authority to inspect any military installation, review any defense plan, and report directly to the Concord's Security Council. They would not answer to any human authority. Their presence would be, in the treaty's own language, indefinite and non-negotiable. The fourth section dealt with reparations. The treaty required the Sol Confederation to pay financial reparations to the Vethari Dominion for the costs incurred during the border conflict. Laura paused when she reached this part and looked at Daniel. The Vethari had started the war. The Vethari had bombed a civilian colony without provocation, and the treaty was asking humanity to pay them for the privilege of being attacked. In exchange for all of this, Section 5 offered humanity a provisional seat on the Concord's lower advisory council. The seat came with no voting rights, no veto power, and no ability to propose legislation. It was, in Laura's words, a chair at a table where they would be allowed to listen, but never allowed to speak. The room was silent when she finished. The legal team sat with their hands in their laps, staring at the table. Kevin leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Daniel had not moved throughout the entire briefing. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded, his face showing nothing. He asked Laura one question. Was there anything in the treaty that could be amended or renegotiated? Laura said no. The final page of the document contained a clause stating that the treaty was to be accepted in its entirety, or not at all. No amendments, no modifications, no counterproposals. It was take it or leave it. Kevin spoke up. He had spent the evening going through intercepted communications that one of his contacts in the Sci-Theme delegation had passed to him. The messages were between senior Concord officials, and they painted a picture that was even darker than the treaty itself. The Concord intended to use this treaty as a template. If humanity accepted these terms, the same framework would be applied to every younger species that came into conflict with an established Concord member. The message was simple: fall in line or be forced into line. And humanity was going to be the example that proved the system worked. Daniel absorbed this in silence. Then he stood and walked to the window. The station's artificial lights had dimmed to simulate nighttime, and the stars beyond the glass were sharp and bright against the black. He said, more to himself than to anyone in the room, that he had spent his entire career believing in diplomacy. He believed that people and nations and civilizations could find common ground if they were willing to sit down and talk honestly with each other. He had come to Althera Prime believing that. He had walked into the Grand Deliberation Chamber believing that. And for 5 days, he had watched that belief be taken apart piece by people who had never intended to negotiate in good faith. Laura asked him what he wanted to do. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were watching him carefully. She had known Daniel for 12 years, and she had never seen him look the way he looked right now. Not angry, not afraid, something deeper than both of those things. Something that looked like a decision being made in a place that words could not reach. Daniel turned from the window and faced his team. He said that he had requested a private audience with Arbiter Silene to discuss possible amendments to the treaty. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. He wanted to give diplomacy one last chance, because he owed that to the people he represented. But he told Laura to begin preparing the steadfast horizon for departure, quietly, without drawing attention. The meeting with Silene took place in a small chamber off the main hall, a room with soft lighting and curved walls that was meant to feel intimate and personal. Silene sat across from Daniel, with her long silver fingers wrapped around a cup of warm liquid that smelled like flowers. She smiled at him the way a teacher might smile at a student who was struggling with a lesson. Daniel laid out his concerns plainly. He told her the treaty was not balanced. He told her the territorial demands were excessive, the military restrictions were one-sided, and the reparations clause was an insult to the 12,000 people who had died on New Elysium. He asked her, directly and simply, whether the Concord was willing to revise any part of the document. Silene listened patiently. When he finished, she set down her cup and spoke to him in a tone that was gentle but carried no warmth. She told him that every young civilization believed it was special. She said that the Telvanni had believed it, and the Korat had believed it. They had all eventually accepted that the Concord's way was the right way, because the Concord had been maintaining peace for 3,000 years and knew better than any single species what was necessary to keep the galaxy stable. She told him that humanity's pride was understandable, but that pride was not a strategy, and that stubbornness was not strength. Daniel asked her again whether the terms could be changed. Silene looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. The mask of patience slipped, just for a second, and what was underneath was not kindness. It was certainty. The certainty of someone who had always gotten what she wanted and could not imagine a world in which she would not. She said the terms were final. She said this with the same soft voice and the same gentle smile, but her eyes were hard, and Daniel understood perfectly. He thanked her for her time and left the room. He walked back to his quarters in silence. Laura was waiting for him. She could see the answer on his face before he spoke. He told her to finish the preparations. They were leaving. Laura nodded and turned to go. Then Daniel stopped her. He said he wanted to do one more thing before they left. He wanted to stand in front of the chamber and say what needed to be said. so that every species in the galaxy would hear it and know exactly why humanity had walked away. Laura looked at him and asked if he was sure. Daniel said he had never been more sure of anything in his life. That night, he sat alone in his quarters and recorded a personal log. He spoke quietly, his voice steady and calm. He said that he had come to Althara Prime, hoping to find partners who believed in fairness and shared respect. Instead, he had found a system built on obedience and dressed in a language of peace. He said that he would not help them build a cage for his people, no matter how beautifully it was decorated. He closed the log, turned off the light, and sat in the dark until morning came. The morning of the 6th day broke across Althara Prime with the quiet hum of systems cycling to life. The station's lights brightened slowly to simulate a sunrise that no one here would ever see. And the corridors filled with alien delegates moving toward the grand deliberation chamber with the relaxed confidence of people who believed the hard work was already done. And for most of them, it was. The treaty had been drafted. The terms had been set. All that remained was the signing ceremony, a piece of theater that would be broadcast across the galaxy as proof that the Concord system worked. That disputes could be settled, younger species could be guided, and order could be maintained. Zoltek arrived early, his black exoskeleton polished to a mirror shine. He took his seat among the Vithari delegation and received quiet congratulations from neighboring representatives who shook his clawed hands and clicked their mandibles in approval. Arbiter Silene ascended to her platform with the unhurried grace of someone who had done this many times before. She arranged her documents, folded her silver hands, and surveyed the chamber with an expression of calm satisfaction. The seats were full. Delegations from over 30 species packed the tiered rows, their translators and advisors filling every available space. News drones hovered near the ceiling, their tiny lights blinking as they prepared to broadcast the ceremony to 100 worlds. The mood in the chamber was almost festive. This was how the galaxy worked. A conflict would flare, the Concord would step in, terms would be set, and the younger species would learn its place. It had happened before. It would happen again. Then the doors at the bottom of the chamber opened, and the human delegation walked in. Daniel entered first. He wore the same dark suit he had worn every day of the negotiations, simple and unadorned, without medals or ribbons or any of the ceremonial decorations that other delegations used to signal their importance. Laura walked beside him, her posture straight, her eyes moving across the room with the quiet alertness of someone who had spent years reading battlefields. Kevin followed close behind, and the rest of the human team filed in after them in a single line, their faces composed and unreadable. The chamber settled into polite silence. Silene looked down from her platform and gestured toward the human table, where the treaty documents waited in a neat stack beside a ceremonial stylus. She began to speak, welcoming the final session and inviting the human delegation to take their seats so the proceedings could begin. Daniel walked to his table. He looked at the documents. He looked at the stylus. Then he turned away from the table and faced the chamber. He did not sit down. The silence in the room changed. It went from polite to uncertain. A few delegates exchanged glances. Zoltek's mandibles stopped moving. Solane's hand, still raised in a gesture of welcome, slowly lowered. Daniel spoke. His voice was not loud, but in that enormous chamber, with its perfect acoustics designed to carry every word to every seat, it did not need to be. He said that he wanted to thank the Galactic Concord for the invitation to negotiate. He said that humanity valued peace and had come to Althara Prime in good faith, hoping to find a resolution that respected the rights and dignity of all parties involved. Then his tone shifted. Not to anger, not to accusation, to something quieter and more powerful than either of those things. He said that over the past 5 days, his delegation had participated in a process that carried the appearance of fairness but not the substance of it. He said that human evidence had been dismissed while Vethari claims had been accepted without scrutiny. He said that the procedural rules had been applied selectively, always to humanity's disadvantage, and that the proposed treaty reflected not a negotiated compromise, but a set of demands imposed on a party that had never been given a genuine voice. He picked up the treaty from the table and held it so the chamber could see it. Then he began to describe its contents. He spoke about the territorial concessions. 3 colony worlds surrendered, including the world whose people had been killed by the very power that now demanded ownership. He spoke about the military restrictions that would leave humanity unable to defend itself. He spoke about the Concord observers who would be stationed on human worlds with authority over human affairs. He spoke about the reparations that asked the victims of an unprovoked attack to pay for the cost of being attacked. The chamber was absolutely still. Not a sound, not a whisper, not a single translator's murmur. Daniel said that he had studied the Concord's founding charter. He had read it carefully, and he quoted from memory the passage that guaranteed sovereign equality for all species, whether members of the Concord or not. He said that the treaty on this table violated that charter in 14 distinct ways that his legal team had documented and would make available to any delegation that wished to review them. He said this not as an accusation, but as a fact, stated plainly and without emotion. Then he set the treaty back on the table and stepped away from it. He said that humanity had not traveled across the darkness between stars to accept chains wrapped in ceremony. He said that the Sol Confederation wanted peace. It wanted peace deeply and sincerely, and would continue to pursue it with every tool available. But peace was not the same thing as submission, and a treaty that demanded one species kneel before another was not a peace treaty at all. It was something else entirely, and he would not insult the intelligence of anyone in this chamber by pretending otherwise. He said that he wished every delegation well. He expressed his hope that one day the Concord would offer terms worthy of the word partnership, because humanity would be ready and willing to meet them at that table when they did. Then Daniel Sawyer turned and walked toward the doors of the Grand Deliberation Chamber. Laura rose from her chair and followed him without a word. Kevin stood and walked behind her. One by one, the rest of the human delegation rose and joined the line, leaving their seats empty, leaving the treaty unsigned on the table, walking in silence up the center aisle, while hundreds of alien eyes watched them go. The chamber erupted. Zoltek was on his feet instantly, his voice a sharp clicking roar that echoed off the stone walls. He demanded that Arbiter Sileni declare the humans in violation of diplomatic protocol. He called their departure an act of contempt and aggression. Several senior delegations shouted their agreement, their translators struggling to keep up with the overlapping voices. Silana raised her hand for silence, but the chamber would not be calmed. The noise grew louder, a wall of alien voices expressing shock, outrage, and confusion in dozens of languages. Then something happened that no one expected. Relvan, the junior ambassador of the Telvanni delegation, stood up. His wide, dark eyes swept the chamber once, slowly, taking in the chaos and the noise and the fury on Zoltek's face. Then he turned and began walking toward the exit. The senior Telvanni ambassador reached for his arm, but Relvan gently pulled free and kept walking. After a moment of hesitation, 2 more Telvanni delegates rose and followed him. The Korath delegation was next. Their lead diplomat, the tall figure with sharp golden eyes, rose from her seat without a word. She looked directly at Arbiter Silane, held her gaze for a long, deliberate moment, and then walked toward the doors. Her entire delegation followed. The Scythene did not even wait for their ambassador to signal. They rose as one, a group of lean nomadic figures in simple traveling clothes, and filed out of the chamber in the same steady silence that the humans had set. 2 more delegations followed within minutes. The Drenari, a quiet species from the Outer Rim, who had barely spoken during the entire negotiation, stood and left. The Velthan, a small delegation of 3 that represented a single-system civilization near human space, packed their documents and walked out without looking back. The chamber was in chaos. Silane's calls for order went unheard. Joltek's outrage had turned to something that looked very much like fear, though his species did not have the facial muscles to express it clearly. The senior delegations that remained in their seats looked at each other with expressions that ranged from stunned to deeply uneasy. Daniel did not see any of this. He was already in the docking bay, standing beside the steadfast horizon, when the other delegations began to arrive. Relvan was first. The Telvanni walked up to Daniel and extended a webbed hand. His dark eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of the station's lights. He said that in 80 years of Telvanni participation in the Concord, no one had ever said what Daniel had just said. No one had ever stood in that chamber and spoken the truth plainly, without fear, without apology. He said that the Telvanni had lived under the Concord's weight for decades, and had forgotten that it was possible to simply say no. Daniel took his hand and shook it. He said that sometimes someone had to go first. Sometimes someone just had to be willing to go first, and once they did, others would find the courage to follow. The Korath diplomat arrived next, followed by the Sithine and the others. They gathered in the docking bay, these representatives of small and overlooked civilizations, and they looked at each other with the cautious recognition of people who had just done something that could not be undone. Kevin was already on his communicator, coordinating departure clearances and arranging secure channels. Laura stood beside Daniel with her arms crossed, watching the gathering crowd with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and concern. She leaned close to Daniel and said quietly that he had just made a lot of very powerful enemies. Daniel nodded. He said he knew. But he also said that he had just made some very important friends, and that in his experience, the second thing mattered more than the first. The steadfast horizon's engines powered up with a low vibration that hummed through the deck plates. One by one, the ships of the departed delegations began to separate from Aelthara Prime's docking rings, their running lights blinking against the dark like a scattering of new stars. Daniel watched them go, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The footage of Daniel Sawyer's speech reached Earth before the steadfast horizon did. It traveled at the speed of light across relay networks and communication buoys, jumping from system to system, translated into 100 alien languages by automated systems that did not understand the weight of the words they carried. By the time Daniel's ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, the entire galaxy had already seen what he had done. On Earth, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People gathered in public squares and watched the recording on massive screens, standing in silence as Daniel's calm voice filled the air. On the colony worlds, citizens who had lived for months under the shadow of war and uncertainty watched their ambassador refuse to bend, and something that had been pulled tight inside them began to loosen. The Sol Confederation's governing council held an emergency session that lasted 14 hours. And when it was over, they issued a statement supporting Daniel's decision unanimously. There was not a single dissenting vote. The galactic reaction was far more complicated. The Concord's inner circle responded with fury. Arbiter Silene issued a formal condemnation within hours of the walkout, calling humanity's departure a reckless act that endangered the stability of the region. She warned that rejecting the peace process would have consequences, and that the Concord could not guarantee the safety of human interests outside Sol space. The language was diplomatic, but the threat beneath it was not subtle. The Vetheri Dominion was louder and more direct. Zoltek gave a public address from his flagship, in which he declared that humanity had chosen confrontation over wisdom. Within days, the Vethari began repositioning their fleet along the border, moving warships into staging areas that put them within striking distance of human colonies. The message was clear. If humanity would not accept peace on the Concord's terms, then the Vethari were prepared to deliver a different kind of lesson. But the response that surprised everyone, including Daniel himself, came from the delegations that had followed humanity out of the Grand Deliberation Chamber. Within a week of the walkout, Relvan sent a secure transmission to the Steadfast Horizon, requesting a formal meeting between the Telvanni, the Korath, the Scythene, the Drenari, the Velthan, and humanity. He proposed that the meeting take place aboard the Steadfast Horizon itself, in neutral space, far from the Concord's reach. Daniel agreed immediately. Laura spent 3 days preparing security protocols and communication frameworks. Kevin reached out to his contacts among the attending species and began building a shared database of cultural norms, diplomatic preferences, and common interests. When the delegations arrived, docking their ships alongside the Steadfast Horizon in a loose formation that glittered against the starfield, Daniel met each ambassador personally at the airlock and welcomed them aboard. The meeting lasted 2 days. It was nothing like the negotiations at Ilthara Prime. There was no grand chamber, no tiered seating, no presiding arbiter looking down from above. They sat together around a single long table in the Steadfast Horizon's mess hall, drinking coffee and Telvanni sea brew and Korath grain tea, and they talked as equals. They talked about what had happened to each of them under the Concord system. The Telvanni spoke about the treaty that had stripped their fleet and opened their waters. The Korath described decades of trade agreements that always seemed to benefit the larger powers. The Scythene, who had no homeworld and depended on freedom of movement for their survival, told stories of routes being closed and caravan fleets being taxed into poverty. And they talked about what they wanted instead. Not revenge, not war, not a rival empire to replace the Concord. They wanted something simpler and harder than any of those things. They wanted a system built on genuine respect, where no species was placed above another by default, where treaties were negotiated honestly, and where the word partnership actually meant what it said. On the second day, they signed a declaration. They called it the Sovereign Compact. It was short, barely 3 pages, written in plain language that anyone could understand. It stated that the signatory species recognized each other as sovereign equals. It established a framework for mutual defense, shared trade, and cultural exchange. It declared that no member of the compact would be asked to surrender territory, reduce its defenses, or accept outside authority over its internal affairs as a condition of membership. And it stated that the compact was open to any species in the galaxy that wished to join on those same terms. The declaration was broadcast from the bridge of the Steadfast Horizon, with Daniel and Relvan standing side by side. Relvan's wide dark eyes were steady as he read the opening lines, and Daniel stood beside him with his hands clasped behind his back and a look on his face that Laura later described as quiet pride. The Concord's response was predictable. Silene dismissed the compact as a collection of minor species playing at politics. Senior Concord members publicly ridiculed the idea that such a small alliance could survive without the Concord's protection. Zoltek called it a provocation and accelerated the Vetheri fleet buildup along the border. But the ridicule did not have the effect the Concord intended. Over the following months, other species began reaching out to the compact through back channels. Some were small civilizations that had long resented the Concord's heavy hand, but had never had the courage to say so openly. Others were mid-level powers who saw in the compact something they had quietly wanted for a long time: an alternative. The compact grew slowly, but steadily, adding 3 more species in the first 6 months, and 2 more before the year was out. Laura threw herself into the military coordination that the compact required. She worked with the Telvanni and Korath to develop joint patrol routes along the border with Vethari space, sharing sensor data and establishing rapid communication protocols that would allow the compact's combined forces to respond quickly to any threat. The Sol Confederation's fleet, still at full strength because Daniel had refused to sign the disarmament clauses, formed the backbone of this defense network, and Laura made sure it was ready. Kevin's work was quieter but no less important. He established cultural exchange programs between the compact's members, arranging visits, language courses, and shared research projects that built the kind of trust that military alliances alone could never create. Telvanni students began attending human universities. Korath musicians performed on Earth for the first time. Scythian caravan fleets were welcomed at human stations with open docking bays and fair trading terms. The bonds between these species were not just strategic. They were personal, and that made them strong. The Vethari tested the compact's resolve twice in those early months. The first time, a squadron of Vethari cruisers crossed into the buffer zone near New Elysium and held position for 72 hours. The compact responded by moving a combined fleet into the area. Human destroyers flying alongside Telvanni cruisers and Korath interceptors. The Vethari withdrew without firing a shot. The second time, a series of Vethari intelligence probes were detected near Briar's Landing. Laura's defense network identified them within minutes, and the probes were escorted out of human space by a patrol wing that included ships from 4 different compact species. The message was received. Back on Earth, Daniel addressed the Sol Confederation's governing council. He stood in the same hall where he had received his orders a year earlier. But everything had changed. He told the council that he had not sought confrontation at Aelthara Prime. He told them that he still believed in diplomacy, and that he always would. But he said that real diplomacy required 2 sides willing to see each other as equals. And until the Concord was ready for that, humanity would build something better with those who already understood it. The council gave him a standing ovation. He accepted it with a small nod and a slight smile, then left the hall and went home to sleep for the first time in what felt like weeks. 1 year after the walkout, on a quiet evening aboard a Sol Confederation station orbiting Mars, Daniel was sitting in his office reviewing trade reports when his terminal chimed with an incoming message. It was encrypted, routed through 3 separate relay systems, and carried no official seal. He opened it and read it twice. It was from Arbiter Silene. The message was brief. She wrote that the Concord was facing internal pressures that had grown considerably since the formation of the Sovereign Compact. She wrote that several senior member species had begun questioning the traditional approach to treaty negotiations, and that the departure of so many smaller species had created political complications that could no longer be ignored. She proposed an informal meeting, not as arbiter and ambassador, but as 2 individuals who shared an interest in the stability of the galaxy. She suggested neutral ground. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the message for a long time. Through the window behind him, the red surface of Mars turned slowly in the light of a distant sun. He could see the lights of the new Telvanni Cultural Center on the surface below, glowing soft blue against the rust-colored landscape. He tapped his communicator and called Laura. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did. He told her to book passage for 2 to the Korath Expanse. He said it seemed like the galaxy was finally ready to have a real conversation, and he intended to be there when it started. Laura asked him if he thought Silene was sincere. Daniel thought about it for a moment. Then he said that it did not matter whether she was sincere today. What mattered was that she was asking, and that a year ago she would never have asked at all. That was progress. That was what change looked like when it was just beginning. He closed the message, stood up, and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, in the cold dark of the Korath expanse, a dead sun still glowed faintly, an old ember that had not yet forgotten the memory of fire. And around it, a station floated in silence, waiting for the day when the people who gathered inside it would finally learn to meet each other as equals. That day, Daniel believed, was coming. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried across 300 light-years by a diplomatic courier drone that shimmered like polished silver as it entered Earth's orbit. It bore the seal of the Galactic Concord, a circle of 42 interlocking symbols representing the oldest and most powerful alliance of alien civilizations in known space. The message was short, it was polite, and it was not a request. The Sol Confederation's governing council read it in silence. The Concord was calling for formal peace negotiations between humanity and the Vithari Dominion. The talks would be held aboard Aelthara Prime, a massive diplomatic station that floated in the cold darkness of the Korath expanse, orbiting a star that had died 1,000,000 years ago. Every major species in the galaxy would be watching. Attendance, the message made clear, was expected. Daniel Sawyer was sitting in his office in Houston when the call came through. He was 53 years old, lean and gray at the temples, with a face that rarely showed what he was thinking. He had spent 20 years in the diplomatic service, negotiating trade deals, border agreements, and refugee treaties with alien governments that often saw humanity as little more than a curiosity. He was patient, he was careful, and he had a reputation for never raising his voice, even when everyone around him was shouting. The council asked him to lead the delegation. Daniel accepted without hesitation. He had followed the Vithari conflict closely, and he knew what was at stake. 6 months earlier, the Vithari Dominion had launched an unprovoked orbital bombardment on New Elysium, a human colony world on the edge of contested space. Over 12,000 civilians had died in a single night. The Sol Confederation had responded with force, pushing the Vithari fleet back across the border in a series of sharp engagements that had surprised everyone, including the Vithari themselves. Now the Concord wanted to talk peace, and Daniel understood that peace could mean many things depending on who was writing the terms. He chose his team carefully. His chief advisor would be Laura Bishop, a former naval strategist who had spent 15 years planning fleet operations before moving into policy work. Laura was sharp, direct, and had very little patience for anyone who tried to waste her time. She had a talent for reading documents the way a surgeon reads a scan, finding the hidden problems that others missed. Daniel trusted her judgment completely. His cultural attaché would be Kevin Grant, a young man of 29 who had grown up on one of Earth's orbital stations, and had studied alien languages and customs since he was a teenager. Kevin was quiet and observant, the kind of person who noticed things that others overlooked. He had contacts among several alien delegations, and a gift for picking up on the unspoken politics that moved beneath the surface of formal diplomacy. Together with a team of translators, legal experts, and military observers, the three of them boarded the diplomatic cruiser Steadfast Horizon and set course for the Korath expanse. The journey took 11 days. Daniel spent most of that time reading everything he could find about the Galactic Concord's history of peace negotiations. What he found did not comfort him. The Concord had brokered dozens of treaties over the centuries, and in nearly every case, the younger or weaker species had come away with less than they had started with. Territory was surrendered, fleets were reduced, Autonomy was quietly stripped away under language so polished that it almost sounded like a gift. The pattern was consistent, and Daniel was not naive enough to believe that humanity would be treated any differently. Laura confirmed his concerns the night before they arrived. She had obtained an early draft of the proposed treaty framework through unofficial channels, and she sat across from Daniel in the cruiser's small briefing room with a look on her face that told him everything before she said a word. The draft contained provisions that would require the Sol Confederation to give up 3 colony worlds, including New Elysium itself, the very world the Vethari had attacked. It called for a 60% reduction in humanity's naval forces. It proposed that Concord military observers be stationed permanently on Earth and Mars. And in exchange for all of this, humanity would receive a provisional advisory seat on the Concord's lower council, a seat with no voting power and no real influence. When Laura finished, he asked her one question. Had any other species in the Concord's history ever been asked to make this kind of sacrifice as a condition of peace? Laura shook her head. Kevin, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, said that his contacts among the smaller delegations had told him the same thing. This level of demand was unusual, even by the Concord standards. It was as if someone had decided in advance that humanity needed to be brought to heel. The Steadfast Horizon arrived at Aelthera Prime the following morning. The station was enormous, a structure of gleaming white metal and curved glass that stretched across the void like a city frozen in space. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species were docked along its outer rings, their designs as varied as the civilizations they represented. Daniel stood at the observation window as they approached, and felt the weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders. The docking process was handled with cold efficiency. A Concord escort met them at the airlock, a pair of tall, silver-skinned Aerolon officials who barely acknowledged the humans as they led them through long corridors to their assigned quarters. The rooms were functional but small, placed in a lower section of the station, far from the main diplomatic suites, where the senior delegations were housed. Their first formal reception was held that evening in one of the station's grand halls. Alien diplomats from across the galaxy mingled beneath lights that shifted color with the mood of the room. Daniel moved through the crowd with a calm smile, introducing himself to every delegation he could reach. Most responded with polite indifference. A few offered brief nods before turning away. The message was clear. Humanity was new. Humanity was small. And humanity was not considered important. The Vethari ambassador arrived late, making an entrance that was clearly designed to draw attention. His name was Zoltek, a massive insectoid figure with a polished black exoskeleton and 4 gleaming eyes that swept the room with open contempt. When he saw Daniel, he crossed the hall and stood over the human ambassador, towering above him by nearly 2 feet. He said in a voice that carried across the room that it was amusing to see infants at the table of elders. Several nearby delegates chuckled softly. Daniel looked up at Zoltek without flinching. He said in a voice just as calm and just as clear that infants had a way of growing up, and that wise elders would do well to remember it. The laughter stopped. Zoltek stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Later that night, Daniel stood alone at the observation window of his quarters, looking out at the endless dark between the stars. Laura came in and asked him what he was thinking. He was quiet for a while. Then he said that humanity had not crossed the void of space to kneel before anyone. They had come to find out whether the galaxy had room for equals, and if it did not, they would make room themselves. Laura nodded and left him alone with the stars. In the distance, the dead sun of the Koreth expanse gave off a faint, cold glow, like an old ember that had not quite forgotten what it meant to burn.